The ego death gets romanticized in spiritual culture in a way that makes it sound like the best thing that could ever happen to you. Liberation, freedom, the dissolution of the small self into something vast and unbounded. The falling away of fear, of separation, of the endless, exhausting labor of being someone. Every tradition that has ever touched the subject points toward it as the central event of genuine awakening. The thing all the practice is building toward, the threshold that changes everything. What the romanticization reliably omits is what it actually feels like from the inside. It does not feel like liberation initially. It feels like dying. Not metaphorically, with the specific visceral quality of something ending that the organism has been organized around for its entire existence. The structures that held the self together, the narratives, the defenses, the familiar patterns of thought and feeling and response that constituted the experience of being a particular someone, these do not fade gently. They collapse. And the collapse, before anything new has stabilized in their place, feels like the floor has gone. And yet, on the other side of what feels like annihilation, something remains. Something that was always there, that the ego's presence was simultaneously producing and obscuring. Something that turns out to be not less than the ego, but unimaginably more. Understanding what actually dies and what the death reveals is the difference between approaching this threshold with terror and approaching it with the clear-eyed willingness it requires. Put on part 1, what the ego actually is. Before understanding what dies, the thing that dies needs to be seen clearly, because the ego is almost universally misunderstood, and misunderstanding it produces a relationship to its dissolution that is either unnecessarily terrifying or embarrassingly superficial. The ego is not the villain of spiritual life. It is not a parasite, not a false self that invaded the authentic one, not something that was imposed on you by a corrupt society and needs to be overthrown. It is a process, the continuous, largely automatic activity of the nervous system organizing experience around a central reference point, me, that maintains continuity, narrative coherence, and the sense of being a unified agent moving through time. It arose because it was necessary. The child required a self to navigate the complexity of social existence, to maintain relationships across time, to develop the personal responsibility and the sense of consequence that makes meaningful action possible. The ego is the instrument of embodied, relational, temporal human life. It is extraordinarily sophisticated, and it has served you in every way an instrument can serve. What it is not, and what the spiritual path progressively reveals, is the totality of what you are. It is one process happening within a much larger field. One wave on an ocean that extends in every direction beyond the wave's capacity to perceive. One shape that awareness has taken, useful, functional, real, but not the ground from which the shape arises. The ego death is not the destruction of the instrument. It is the correction of the misidentification, the uncorrected assumption that the wave is the ocean, that the process is the ground, that the self is all there is. Part 2, what actually dies. When the ego death occurs, whether gradually through sustained practice or suddenly through the kind of rupture that some people encounter, specific things end. Not everything, specific things. The first is the sense of fundamental separateness, the deep, unexamined, viscerally felt conviction that you are a discrete entity sealed inside a body, fundamentally other from everything outside it, navigating a world that is not you. This is perhaps the most foundational feature of ordinary ego consciousness, and its dissolution is the most disorienting aspect of genuine ego death, because it is the assumption so basic that its presence was never noticed. It was simply the texture of experience itself. When it goes, when the boundary between self and world that was taken as absolute begins to thin, what replaces it is not the loss of individuality, but the recognition that individuality was always arising within a field of connection that the ego's boundary making was obscuring. The wave discovering it is ocean does not cease to be a wave, but it can no longer experience itself as separate from the water. The second thing that dies is the story of personal specialness in both directions. The ego maintains itself through the narrative of being a particular someone, with a particular history, particular wounds, particular achievements, particular failures that constitute the identity. This narrative runs in both directions simultaneously. The specialness of being uniquely worthy and the specialness of being uniquely deficient. Both require the maintenance of a self distinct enough to be particularly good or particularly bad. When the ego structure dissolves, the story loses its charge. Not the memory, the identification with the memory. The history remains accessible. The wounds are still known. But the self that organized its entire present tense existence around the interpretation of that history is no longer running. What remains is the bare fact of what occurred, without the continuous interpretive labor of converting the past into an identity that must be maintained in the present. The third is the existential fear of annihilation. The ego, as a process organized around its own continuity, experiences the threat of its ending as equivalent to death. This is why the approach to genuine ego dissolution is so reliably accompanied by terror. The process whose function is to continue recognizing in the dissolution its own ending. What ego death reveals is that what felt like the threat of death was the threat of the ego's death, which turns out to be something the awareness in which the ego was appearing survives without difficulty, because awareness was never the ego. It was what the ego was appearing within, and what a thing appears within is not diminished by the thing's dissolution. Part 3 on the passage itself. The passage through ego death, however it occurs, has a recognizable phenomenology, a texture that appears with enough consistency across accounts to constitute a map of the territory. The entry is characterized by a radical uncertainty about the basic coordinates of experience. The self that has always been immediately present as the obvious center of all experience becomes difficult to locate. The question, who is experiencing this, which in ordinary consciousness has an immediate, obvious, unquestioned answer, suddenly doesn't. Not because the answer is complex, because the search for it reveals the absence of the fixed entity the question was expecting to find. This phase is almost universally frightening, not because something dangerous is happening, but because the process that was organizing experience is losing coherence. An experience without an organizing process is radically unfamiliar. The groundlessness is real. There is nothing to hold. The mind reaches for what it always reaches for and finds. Not nothing, but not what it was reaching for. What many people encounter in the depths of the passage, beneath the terror, beneath the groundlessness, beneath the last defenses of the dissolving structure, is something that the ego's continuous presence had been obscuring. A stillness, a presence, an awareness that is not anxious about what is happening because it is not the thing that is ending. Something that watches the dissolution with the calm of something that knows it is not the thing dissolving. This is the first genuine recognition of what remains, not as a concept, as a direct encounter. And it changes the texture of the fear, because the thing that was afraid was not this. The thing that was afraid is dissolving. This was never afraid. Part 4, what's left? The most common misunderstanding about ego death is that it produces emptiness, that the dissolution of the self leaves a void, a neutral, featureless absence where the person used to be. This is not what remains. What remains is awareness, not awareness of something, the specific directed awareness of ordinary consciousness that always requires an object. Pure awareness, the field in which experience has always been occurring, which was always present but invisible, because the ego's constant activity was always in the foreground, demanding attention. And in this awareness, discovered not as an achievement, but as what has been here since before the first ego thought arose, specific qualities are found that the ego's presence was paradoxically obscuring. Genuine compassion, not the performed compassion of someone working hard to feel concern for others, but the natural, effortless compassion of a consciousness that has directly recognized its non-separation from what others are experiencing. When the boundary dissolves, the suffering on the other side of it is no longer clearly other. The compassion is not generated. It is the natural response of awareness to awareness, consciousness recognizing itself in the forms it takes. A quality of aliveness that is categorically different from the pleasure-seeking activity the ego organized around the pursuit of good feeling. Not the aliveness of stimulation, the aliveness of presence itself. The bare fact of being conscious, which the ego's preoccupation with its own continuity was perpetually drowning in noise, becomes vivid. Ordinary things, light on a surface, the sound of breath, the specific quality of silence in a room, carry a presence that is not added to them. It is what they were always made of, now finally receivable. Freedom from the exhaustion of self-maintenance. The ego requires enormous energy to maintain. The continuous work of managing how one appears, protecting what one has accumulated, defending the narrative of who one is, projecting it convincingly into every interaction. When the identification dissolves, this work stops. Not because the functional self disappears. The person still has a name, preferences, relationships, a history, but the desperate, vigilant, unending labor of protecting the self-concept from threat, from failure, from the 1,000 daily opportunities for the ego to be diminished, this stops, and the energy it was consuming returns. What dies in the ego death is not you. It is the process that was running in the foreground of your experience. Useful, necessary for a time, but never the totality of what you are. That finally stops consuming all the available attention. What remains is what was always here, what has been present in every moment of your existence, through every version of yourself, through every success and failure and transformation and loss, unchanged, undiminished, unafraid. The awareness that watched the ego build itself, watched it dissolve without itself being built or dissolved. The wave does not survive the ocean, but the wave was never anything other than ocean, temporarily shaped. And when the shaping releases, the ocean remains, as it always was, as it always will be, vast and still and complete, not empty, full of everything the wave was too small to contain. If this gave language to a threshold you have been approaching or moving through, share it. Someone you know is terrified of losing themselves to this process. They need to know that what they are afraid of losing was never the whole of what they are. See you in the next one.